All right, this last portion of Chapter 13 is going to deal with the processing that takes place with regard to spinal reflexes. Okay, peripheral nervous system elements activate effectors by neurotransmitter release, and this is an example of what we call a chemical synapse, where we have an axon terminal that is a short distance removed from the surface of the target, right? And it's the release of the neurotransmitter onto the surface of the target that is going to create electrical changes on the membrane that could lead to an action potential. Now, with regard to movement, okay, voluntary movement is generated at the level of the cerebral cortex. Okay, the motor association area assembles the plan. The precentral gyrus, where the motor cortex is where the finalized plan is sent, and then what happens is that it will descend down through the thalamus, past the thalamus, and the brainstem, and into the spinal cord, where a copy of that plan will go to the cerebellum, and a copy of that plan will go down from the upper motor neurons to the lower motor neurons. Okay, the cerebellum and the basal nuclei are the planners and coordinators of complex motor activity. The complex behavior depends on patterns of control that exist at both the segmental, projection, and the pre-command level. Okay? The pre-command level are the cerebellum and basal nuclei that work with instructions that are essentially received from the cerebral cortex, okay, and compared to sensory input in order to check to make sure that what's happening and what you intend are the same. Okay. The instructions, as a result, go to two locations, right? We go from the motor cortex to the cerebellum and basal nuclei, right? But we also go from the motor cortex down to the brainstem and spinal cord, right? And then that goes to the motor output, okay? Now, the the execution of a spinal reflex bypasses a lot of this. In a spinal reflex, what happens is that sensory input impinges on an interneuron, which hits a motor output, and you generate a reflex that's designed to enhance our ability to survive without having to go through all these different levels of motor control. So these are some of the most primitive nerve pathways and probably the first pathways to develop in evolution. Okay? The segmental level is the lowest level of the motor hierarchy. Central pattern generators are circuits that activate networks of ventral horn neurons. Those are going to lie in the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and they stimulate sets of muscles for repeated motor activity, such as maintenance of posture and walking. Okay? The projection level are upper motor neurons that run from the cerebral cortex to the lower motor neurons and initiate the pyramidal system to produce voluntary skeletal muscle movement. Brainstem motor areas that oversee indirect motor pathways, which are called extrapyramidal, control reflex and central pattern generated motor action. The projection motor pathways send information to lower motor neurons and keep the higher command levels aware of what's happening. In the cerebellum and the basal nuclei, we see regulation of the motor activity as well as the ability to stop and start the movement, to coordinate the movement, and to block unwanted movement and monitor muscle tone. It also performs planning and discharge in advance of movement that is unconscious. Okay, the cerebellum is designed to fine-tune our motor activity because it has a connection to the cerebral cortex, specifically the precentral gyrus. Well, the basal nuclei inhibit motor centers under resting conditions. So what happens here is we have a coordination of different structures, right? You can see the brainstem nuclei that are involved and the precentral gyrus, right, highlighted in green. And then you can see the basal nuclei in the cerebellum. Okay? Now, what's going on here is that the planning takes place here. The plan gets sent here. And then we have to remove the blockage of the plan executing by influencing uh, part of the pre-command level, which is called the globus pallidus. Okay, once we remove the inhibition of the globus pallidus, then we can allow the neurons in the precentral gyrus to fire. The pyramidal projection goes down from the cortex past the thalamus to the brainstem. A copy of this goes to the cerebellum, and the other copy goes from the upper to the lower motor neurons. Okay, so this is critical, right? Because the brainstem also gets input from proprioception and our eyes and our inner ear in order to compare what we're doing with what we intend, right? And as a result, it can fix any error, send it back up to um, the projection level, right? And then repeat the entire process so we can fine tune the movement. Reflexes are involuntary, predictable responses to a stimulus designed to enhance the ability of us to survive. They can be used to do things like maintain posture and control visceral activity, and can be modified with conscious effort. Acquired reflexes result from practice and repetition, while other reflexes are hardwired. All the components of a reflex arc are designed for speed, and that's one of the reasons that we don't have to involve the higher levels of control, right? We don't have to bring in the brainstem and the cerebral cortex. When we do a reflex arc, it all happens within that spinal segment and the peripheral nerves associated with it. The receptor is the site of the stimulus. The sensory neuron transmit the afferent impulses to the central nervous system. The integration center is within the central nervous system gray matter here. The motor neuron brings the motor command out to the target, and the effector carries it out. Okay, so you can see the components here. All right, in this case, we're looking at a reflex such as the withdrawal reflex, where a painful stimulus initiates an electrical signal that provides a response, a reflex, which involves pulling the affected area away from the pain. Okay, so you can see here, there's an afferent neuron, there's an interneuron, and there's a motor neuron that goes out to, in this case, a skeletal muscle effector, and the integration is within the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay? Somatic reflexes target skeletal muscle only, and visceral reflexes target everything else. Okay, so when we're talking of reflex, again, we're talking not needing to involve the brainstem or the cerebral cortex in the case of the somatic reflexes. Okay? Spinal somatic reflexes are integrated in the spinal cord, and their targets are skeletal muscle. We test these reflexes to assess the condition of the nervous system. If they're exaggerated or distorted or absent, then there's something wrong with those regions. We either got a problem with the peripheral nerve components, or we may have a problem in the gray matter of the spinal cord at that level. Okay. Another thing that it can indicate is damage to upper motor neurons, okay, which in part modulate the execution of these spinal reflexes. The stretch and the tendon reflex coordinate skeletal muscle movement, and they work on proprioceptor information that tells it about the length of the muscle from the muscle spindles and the tension in the muscle from the Golgi tendon organs. The information that comes from the muscle spindles, these are receptors that respond to stretch. The intrafusal muscle fibers are wrapped in a connective tissue capsule, while the effectors are the extrafusal fibers that actually do the contraction. Okay, So the idea here is that you don't want to overstretch the muscle or it'll tear. Okay. The stretch reflex maintains muscle tone in postural muscles and adjusts it, causes muscle contraction when it's overstretched. The stretch reflex activates the spindle, the sensory neuron synapse with alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord, which make the stretched muscle contract, and that keeps it from tearing. Okay? Note that all the stretch reflexes are monosynaptic and ipsilateral, meaning there's one synapse and they occur on the same side as the stimulus. Reciprocal inhibition also takes place. There are fibers that synapse with interneurons that inhibit alpha motor neurons in the antagonistic muscle. An example is the patellar reflex, where the stretched muscle, which is the quads, contracts and the antagonists relax, and that allows you to kick. Okay? And you can initiate that reflex by hitting the patellar tendon with a reflex hammer. Positive reflex reactions tell us that the peripheral nerve components and the gray matter in the spinal cord are intact. Okay? The strength of the response indicates how excitable the spinal cord is. If the reflex is hypoactive or absent, then there's probably peripheral nerve damage, but if it's hyperactive, then there may be problems with the upper motor neurons. Okay? So you can see here how the stretch reflex works. Okay? We activate the muscle fibers that are going to reduce the stretch in the muscle that the stimulus comes from, and we inhibit the fibers that would oppose those movements. The opposite effect is the tendon reflex. It's a polysynaptic reflex that prevents damage due to excessive stretch of the tendon. It's important for the smooth onset and the termination of muscle contraction. So the idea here is that you tap the patellar ligament and that stretches it. Okay, so the quadriceps stretch, the tendon stretches, the muscle spindles are excited, the stimulus travels to the spinal cord, it synapses with motor neurons, which then send activating impulses to the quadriceps muscle, making it contract, and that extends the knee. The interneurons also have inhibitory synapses with ventral horn neurons that prevent the antagonists from resisting the contraction of the quadriceps. Okay? So you can see how, again, that works. The tendon reflex produces muscle relaxation in response to tension. Contraction or passive stretch activates the tendon reflex. The afferent impulse is transmitted to the spinal cord and the contracting muscle relaxes and the antagonist contracts, and this information is also sent to the cerebellum and adjusts muscle tension. So here, right, we have a tendon organ, okay? The quadriceps contracts, the tendon organ is activated. We send the information past the dorsal root ganglia to the dorsal root into the spinal cord, and then we have the activation of two interneurons. One is going to cause the efferent impulses of the antagonist muscle to contract, right? So the hammies will contract while the quadriceps will relax, okay? So what that's doing, right, is that's removing some of the tension from the quadriceps tendon, right? When the hamstrings are contracting, okay, they are reducing the tension that's the result of the pull from the quad, okay? And so the tension in the affected connective tissue is reduced, and it's less likely that it's going to tear, okay? So what this does is this basically works opposite the way that the muscle spindle works, okay? We don't want to tear the tendon, but we also do not want to tear the muscle, okay? The cross extensor reflex happens on two sides of the body, the ipsilateral side where the stimulus is applied, and the contralateral side, which is on the opposite side from where the stimulus is. It's initiated by a painful stimulus and causes withdrawal of the threatened body part. It's ipsilateral and polysynaptic. It's protective. The brain can override it. Examples include an injection or a finger stick for a blood test. The cross-extensor reflex that comes with it occurs with the flexor in the weight-bearing limb to maintain the balance. It consists of ipsilateral withdrawal and contralateral extensor. The stimulated side is withdrawn and the contralateral side is extended. An example is walking on the beach and stepping barefoot on broken glass. The affected limb will go up, but to maintain your balance, the opposite limb will go bolt straight and you won't fall over. Okay? And again, the brain gets this information, but it gets it after the reflex has been executed. And as a result, it's quicker to execute. It acts in a way that enhances our survival, right? And it's very speedy, right? Because there aren't that many synapses involved and the distances are relatively short, in addition to the fact that the fibers involved are some of the fastest in the nervous system, the 250 mile an hour type. Okay? All right, I'll join everybody for the next podcast. I thank you for listening.